Welcome to this presentation on the first lab block informational video. This video will cover all the basics for teaching in the first lab block. Let's get started by looking at the components of the first lab block. Overall, this lab will focus on the technical and analytical aspects of completing ECGs. In total, each student must successfully complete 50 ECGs in order to master the lab component. Later on, we'll take a closer look at what successfully completing an ECG means. In addition to completing ECGs, students will also participate in a 2-hour body mechanics workshop, a 2-hour aseptic techniques workshop, and N95 mask fit testing done by specific instructors or contractors who have been orientated to teaching these workshops. Each regional site will be provided with an instructor lab binder. In this resource, you will find important documents to assist you in instructing a successful and rewarding Lab Block 1 experience. To maintain consistency in supporting our instructors, evaluations will be uniform across all regional sites. Please ensure that you review this document on Moodle prior to attending the Lab Block 1 instructor-only day. A detailed lab schedule has been mapped out for each lab site. This detailed schedule includes a session-by-session breakdown of each activity, a procedural time goal, and summary of activities that include both ECG technique and interpretation topic. In addition, other lab activities such as body mechanics and aseptic technique workshops have also been mapped out on this schedule. The Evaluation Instructor Notes is a very important document for all instructors to review prior to evaluating students on the practical skills assessment. It is important students do not see this document as it is for faculty eyes only. Checkboxes to note if a student has met or not met competency will need to be checked off during the assessment. Questions are provided for instructors to use as examples of what to ask students to gauge their competency on a topic if it is not being observed during the assessment and needs to be reviewed in further discussion outside of the hands-on component of the final assessment. Following these guidelines will ensure consistency and fair evaluation across all regional sites. The next handout, How Not to Complete versus How to Complete an Evaluation, is a very important document you must review in your role as a lab instructor. Please ensure that you review this handout carefully to see the difference between filling it out correctly versus incorrectly, as this document is extremely important for our accreditation process. Some important things to highlight are instructors must ensure that the checkboxes all have a check in either the met or the not met column. Instructors also should make sure that student names versus instructor names are filled out on the correct line. Students should put their name or initials on the top of every page of their assessment to avoid any mix-ups happening at the time that these exams are unstapled and scanned in to be uploaded online. Instructors should leave detailed written feedback for students, especially if a competency was not met. We want to see that you are leaving both positive and constructive comments written on the assessment with a minimum of 2 comments per page. And then lastly, new as of 2024, in the final paragraph stating whether the student was successful or not, please ensure that you circle has or has not met competency on the student's assessments. This will help highlight that students achieved mastery or non-mastery, such as when students write their midterms versus their final practical skills assessment. A set of ECG requisitions have also been provided. There are 23 complete requisitions and 5 blank ones. You can use these 5 blank requisitions to fill in made-up information. The purpose of the requisitions is so students can get practice reviewing requisitions and typing in information into the computer. In order to simulate various situations students might encounter while working in real clinical settings, a number of ECG scenarios have been provided. These scenarios can be given to the patient at the beginning of the ECG procedure. Each scenario will accompany ECGs that the instructor should use in place of the patient's actual ECG. An answer key has also been provided. It is important to note that when patients are instructed to act out a scenario, if they do encounter actual symptoms during the scenario, they are to say the following safety statement. I am not playing a role. I am feeling XYZ pain and/or discomfort. It is important to also inform students during the orientation process that patients may be given roles to play during the ECG procedure, and should the patient say that following safety statement, they should follow the emergency and safety procedures set out for that lab site. Next is ECGs. ECGs have been provided in an electronic format in the instructor course, and physical copies are included in a binder sent with the lab supplies. The purpose of these ECGs are twofold. First, the ECGs can be used by students for analysis as they work in either breakout groups or at their desk individually, while other students are performing, volunteering, or observing ECG procedures. The second purpose for these ECGs is to replace the typical healthy ECG tracing that are being produced by students and other individuals volunteering for ECG procedures. Out of the total 50 ECG procedures students need to complete, the first 5 to 10, the student is able to use the ECG that comes from the volunteer patient themselves. With the remaining 40 to 45 ECG procedures that the student needs to complete, the instructor will replace the volunteer's ECG with an abnormal ECG, and the student will then provide an analysis on this abnormal ECG. Answer keys for each ECG is also provided in the lab binders. As noted on the detailed lab schedule, the first 2 hours of each lab will be used to orientate students to the lab. A lab instructor orientation checklist has been developed and added to the first lab block instructor manual, which can be found in the first lab block instructor course on Moodle. This lab instructor orientation checklist provides a detailed breakdown of everything that needs to be covered with the students during orientation. Skipping over items on this checklist is not optional, as it is important that students be orientated thoroughly to the first lab block. A resource called Create a Working Agreement with Your Class has been provided to assist during the first 10 minutes of orientation when you'll be creating professional standards within the classroom. You will note this come up on the orientation checklist at a certain point in time. Please follow and ensure that this is covered in orientation. Now let's spend some time looking at the various handouts and forms that will be used during the first lab block. All handouts and forms can be found on the first lab block instructor course in Moodle. Many of these handouts are also found in the first lab block instructor manual as a sample example of what the form looks like. All of these handouts and forms will be printed in hard copy and sent out to each regional lab site with the lab supplies. Lab instructors are not responsible for making the initial copies of these handouts, but we do expect instructors to hand out the appropriate student forms to the students during lab. Handouts and forms have been split up depending on whether they are for instructors or for students. Let's first take a look at the handouts and forms available to instructors. The next few handouts are the faculty procedures for each lab sites. These procedures include important information relevant to the specific site, such as contact information, opening and closing times, emergency protocols, cleaning protocols, and more. Please spend some time familiarizing yourself with these procedures and be prepared to review the relevant procedures with students during the 2-hour lab block orientation. Student medical alert forms are to be filled out on orientation night with students. These forms should be reviewed by the lead lab instructor. Any concerns that arise from these forms should be shared with faculty teaching at that lab site, as well as the department head and student success coordinator. Concerns may be allergies, student medical conditions or medications they are taking that contraindicate testing, or medical conditions that faculty just should be aware of in case of an emergency. The information on these forms are to remain confidential and should only be shared outside of the college with medical professionals assisting in active emergency situations with this patient. The next set of handouts and forms we'll look at are for students. The first two are the student and volunteer waiver forms. Please take some time during the orientation to review both of these waivers with students. It is very important that anyone participating in ECG procedures, whether it be a student or an external volunteer, must sign off on these forms. During orientation, students must each sign off a waiver and submit it to the lead lab instructor. At the end of the lab block, the student waivers must be submitted to Stenberg College in the appropriate Dropbox. Any individual coming in to volunteer as a patient must also sign off on the volunteer waivers. There will be a new volunteer waiver for each lab day. If an individual volunteers more than one day, he or she must sign off the waiver each time. The next form is the Final Practical Skills Assessment, ECG. This is the evaluation students will be assessed on to determine whether they have mastered the first lab block ECG component. There will be 3 copies of this evaluation for each student. During the orientation, students will receive 1 copy to hold onto as a reference throughout their lab block. The other 2 copies will be completed at the midpoint after students complete 25 ECGs, and then again at the end for students' 50th ECG procedure. Both the midterms and the finals will be given to the lead lab instructor for them to scan in and upload to the appropriate folder provided to them by Stenberg College. It is important during the orientation to take some time to review this evaluation with students so they know exactly what they are being assessed on. Each successful ECG a student completes will meet the criteria as listed on the Final Practical Skills Assessment, ECG. The ECG log sheet is another handout students will receive during orientation. After each successful ECG procedure and each successful ECG interpretation, the student will have their instructor sign off on the log sheet showing that they have met competency for that ECG procedure. By the end of lab, students will receive 50 signatures on this log sheet. Students are to submit the log sheets to their lead lab instructor so that at the end of lab block, the leads can scan these in and submit them to Stenberg College. At the beginning of this presentation, we discussed how students would be working in breakout groups throughout each lab session to analyze ECGs. In addition to this activity, the last 15 minutes of each lab session, starting in session 2, has been dedicated for ECG analysis. The ECG interpretation activity handout will guide students through this exercise. Finally, a lab safety checklist has been included for students. Safety is one of the most important factors of the lab, and it is crucial that the lab instructional team review the safety checklist with students during the lab orientation. Each student must complete the lab safety checklist themselves and confirm their understanding of each point. Please ensure that details that students list on their checklist include the proper site protocols and is the same for all students that are attending that lab site. Lastly, let's take some time to discuss instructor requirements during the first lab block. As an instructor, you will monitor students' progress as they complete their 50 successful ECGs and provide students with both verbal and written feedback. For each successful ECG, written feedback will be provided on the student's ECG log sheet. Please ensure that this feedback includes information on what they can improve on for their next ECG procedure sign-off. As students practice their ECGs, you will be able to provide volunteer patients with scenarios to act out in order to simulate real clinical settings. Requisitions and ECG scenarios will be shipped to each lab site from the college and be used during these scenarios. A big component of the first lab block is to work on students' ECG analysis skills. Throughout each session, students will rotate between completing ECGs, acting as volunteer patients, observing ECGs, and working in groups or individually to analyze ECGs. At the end or the beginning of each lab session, the entire class will come together to complete an ECG interpretation activity, and as the instructor, you will guide the students through this activity. Our main goal as instructors is to help ensure our students meet and master the components of our first lab block. Students must have a check mark in the MET column for each competency on the final practical skills assessment in order to have mastered the ECG component of the first lab block. Should any student be at risk of not mastering the ECG component due to falling behind in mastering ECG procedures, due to academic concerns, professionalism issues, or other, then it is important to notify the Student Services Coordinator as well as the department head in a written email as soon as possible. A written alert should be emailed to the student so that they can make changes based on the feedback given. Alert email templates have been provided in the online instructor course on Moodle for you to use. As a reminder, lab days are all mandatory to attend. So if a student is late, leaves early, or is absent, you must immediately email and notify both the Student Success Coordinator and the department head immediately. This takes us to the end of the lab block informational video. In preparation for the instructor orientation Q&A session, please post any questions you have in the first lab block discussion forum in session 4 of this course.